You're live.
Hey, that's much better.
We like being live
Yes.
and alive.
Because when it was saying you're dead before that, I felt threatened.
YouTube got real dark for a minute.
So it's the dark web.
Oh gosh, I can't move my head. I went to look at my phone and it was just a mistake.
Well, if we're live, it's good I stopped yelling at you then.
See the yelling. I like the countdown on this, so you can time out your yelling.
There you go.
Ahoy!
We get a good yelling pace that way.
Yelling pace.
Greetings, salutations.
How are you?
Well, I can turn my head, so
better than me. Better than me.
I'm doing all right.
I'm doing all right.
I got my 80s throwback going. I don't have a Izod Lacoste sweater. So,
I've got my 90s sitting in Central Perk look going on, even though I don't have coffee. You're the one with coffee. We're all screwed up today. All screwed up.
We did drink coffee in the 80s too.
No, you didn't. It was definitely a 90s invention.
We didn't drink at Central Perk.
Out of giant mugs.
We didn't drink at Starbucks.
Starbucks
didn't really exist.
Starbucks was definitely a 90s thing, right?
Yes.
That was a 90s.
It may have started, I can't vouch for this. If anybody
we can look it up
cares
right now.
and is paying attention, you can tell me for sure. But it may have started in Seattle in the late 80s, or something like that. But it definitely wasn't nationwide until the 90s. Coffee shops.
Wow, really 1971.
Really? Just in Seattle?
At Pike Place in Seattle.
When did it go national?
That's one of the places I want to go because I want to see him throw a fish.
That's a thing?
At Pike's Place, yeah.
Why would you throw a fish? That sounds like a Muppet Show.
They have a fish market there, and the fishmongers throw these huge fish.
Huh. All right. Shelley used to go to a place in Missouri, Sykeston, I believe. They had what they called throwed rolls, where they would throw your rolls.
I've seen that. So. My fear is that I wouldn't catch it, and then I'd be upset that we're wasting bread.
Well,
I'd probably still eat it even if it landed.
I was going to say that's my upbringing. I'd snatch it off there and go from there.
I couldn't work at a place like that because if I didn't like somebody, I'd throw the roll a little too hard.
I am guessing that if you combine that with Ed DeBevick's, you just
another place people. I've never been because I cannot take criticism from anybody.
Stacy orders her food, leaves
crying into my burger. Why don't you like me?
I am always curious at why people would pay to be insulted. I'm I could be insulted for free. That's pretty easy.
That's the same thing I have with scary movies. Why are you paying to be scared?
Right. Yeah.
I will pay to laugh. I will pay to cry. I'm not paying to be scared.
There's, especially creepy stuff, and it seems like every time I, trying to watch a show on all these streaming services, all the commercials for whatever the newest Netflix original or Max original or they're all creepy. It's all like people serial killers creepy. And psychos and
I can do stuff like that. I don't know. I don't like things that jump out at me. I can't do
creepy, or
I can be creepy. I can't do jump scares. Like if there's a movie and something's going to pop out, nope, not for me.
How about like in Indiana Jones, things like that, where that's
fine because I know this right. But, yeah. And I can do like psychological thrillers or whatever. But if something's going to pop out, even if I know what's going to happen, like if someone's going to pop out of the closet with a knife, and I'm like, oh, that's obviously what's going to happen, it still scares the heck out of me. So.
Yeah. I tend to avoid that in real life as well.
Someone pop it out of the closet with a knife.
It's like, you're not welcome in my house if you're gonna pop out with a knife.
Please leave my house.
Yeah.
You with the knife. You wielding and yielding.
There's a lot of strange things that go on in this world of sin, for sure.
That's fact.
It is. As you mentioned that though, it is astonishing the economic impact of selling sin. Look at Hollywood. How many movies? Now you have to have some heroic element in there. You have to have some positive element, or it tends to not do really well. But how many things are, just like majoring in sinful things, whether it's the horror shows or, illicit romance stuff. That so many of the romances over the years have been about the romance and beauty of adultery, of cheating. Right. I'm with the wrong person. I got to be with the right person. All these different things, and there's so much appeal to people in this worldly fantasy in a variety of ways. So one that I've never actually watched the movie, but I remember when it came out, and I said, man, I can understand that mentality.
The Notebook.
No, well, that's a great movie, but anyhow, still with some illicit things in there. But anyway, there's a Michael Douglas movie back in the 90s, favorite decade of yours, when you were far too young to even watch it, called, is it Falling Up? I think it's Falling Up. No, Falling Down. There's a falling involved, and I don't know what direction. But anyway, so he's like a businessman, and the corruption of society has pushed him over the
Played
edge.
a lot of businessmen in the 90s.
Yeah, well, this one, he's got like the horn rim glasses and the flat top, and he's like he's like a cog in the machine, but he's just had enough with the corruption and crime and gangs and all that kind of stuff, and he goes vigilante and starts killing everybody. I'm like, I can see the appeal of that. And how much more now today? Think of the insanity of our world.
And he's supposed to be the good guy in the movie, right?
Yeah, it's kind of an anti-hero sort of thing where it's just the man pushed too far. And we've seen those types of things all the way back to, Billy Jack in the 70s and where it's just too much and you can't take it and you snap. And, there's, did you ever see Diary of a Mad Black Woman?
I've seen scenes from it, but I haven't seen the whole thing.
Actually, really good movie, but same kind of thing where she's pushed too far, But Gabe's favorite celebrity crush, Shamar Moore, is in it. Good looking man, right there.
He is a good looking guy. He's on not CSI, Criminal Minds, something. One of those.
He was. I don't know if he still is. When we were watching it, he was on there, and he was on. Was it FBI? He's done a few. He's
pretty much the same
FBI
character
or
in
SWAT
everything
or something
plays.
like that. Yeah, the really good looking, handsome guy that everybody likes. It's so typecast. But anyway, so that's a movie that has all of these bad elements in it.
He's in the Sonic the Hedgehog movie too.
He is not.
Playing a cop. I've only seen that because George has made me watch that 45 times.
Well, now Gabe's going to go watch Sonic the Hedgehog. Which was Ricky's character back in the day. Ricky fully identified with Sonic.
Who's also very typecast.
Well, so was Ricky. So as that movie plays out, there's a lot of bad, there's a lot of stuff, but there is a redemptive thread that goes through it. Tyler, in my opinion, it's probably the best Tyler Perry movie that I've seen.
You've seen a lot of Tyler Perry movies?
A few.
I don't know that I've ever seen one.
You're missing out. There's
Medea.
She's in this as well. There are so many things that we do in our world that just are selling sin. I mean,
it's almost to the point
the music industry.
Well,
it's so much,
Maybe even worse than the movie industry is the music industry.
Seems like these days, especially.
But that's the thing is it's everywhere, and I feel like we almost are at the point where we're becoming numb to it.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's just kind of par for the course at this point. And if you want to watch anything on TV or watch a movie or listen to music, whatever, it's like, well, this is just how things are. Yeah. And so I think the line gets moved.
Yeah.
And we kind of stretch what we think is okay to consume.
Yeah. Which tends to be kind of the goal of not necessarily, I'm not saying the movie industry, music industry, but what begins as transgressive and artistically you're striving for that. You want to transgress, you want to break up the stereotypes and the norms, the social mores, so that people are offended and think. Poetry, comedy, there's so much of this that is intentionally transgressive, and then as you transgress, it moves the line.
Right.
So then people get adjusted to that, they get used to it, and what was transgression before becomes white noise, and it's just in the background, it's just normal. Look at, as you were mentioning, just the effect of it. Consider sex outside of marriage. There was a time when that was just not something you would talk about on television. It's not that it didn't happen. It's happening in Genesis. So it's not like there's ever been a time when that didn't happen. but it became so normalized that from the 1970s forward, you would be hard pressed to find anything in the music industry, movie industry, television industry that doesn't presume that.
Right.
That's just normal. Now, that wasn't normal in the lives of all people, but it was normal in a lot, and it was increasing until when I was in high school in the 80s. Obviously, kids do things that they do. We're sinful people. High schoolers tend to do sinful things, but it was still expected that good girls don't to go that far. And it was happening younger and so on and so forth. By the time you get to the 90s, it's greatly shifted. By the time you get to 2000s and now, for a lot of folks, it's just assumed if you're dating, this is what you're doing. It's assumed that you'll live together before you get married. Again, those were very taboo things not that long ago. And while I am obviously an exceedingly old man, within my lifetime, it's been a complete 180 on so many of these things where I personally know people who are called pastors, and I have to use the term loosely, who actually endorse or advise people to live together before they get married.
Well,
it's a ridiculously horrible situation.
And it's funny because the further the line moves, the further away it seems to get from a Christian standpoint from the way we're supposed to be living.
Right.
And so then if you try to live the way you're supposed to be living, you look crazier and crazier because the line has gone so far.
Even within the church.
Right.
So then folks who call themselves Christians have become so accustomed to sinfulness. We've just kind of come to terms with it. So yeah, it's not right, but it's just the way of the world. It's how it's normal. It's all that. So then you start to go along with it and you start to expect it. And that because of the shifting of the transgressions, now we come to a place where it's not enough to accept it. You have to celebrate it.
Right.
And then celebration becomes accepted and this becomes the norm.
Have you heard the song by Doechii called Anxiety? It's all over like TikTok.
Yeah.
I mean, you probably have heard it. She's sampling that song, Somebody That I Used to Know. Oh, you're just somebody that I used to know. Yeah. Anyway, it's all over. And I hate it because it's so catchy. And I have anxiety. And I'm like, dang, she's really hitting on some points here. But it's...
I'm still vibing on that Boys Are Boys song.
Yeah, that's a good one. So. But for all intents and purposes, it's kind of an inappropriate song in many ways. But it's all over. And so the other day on TikTok, I saw somebody cover it and they were replacing it with, they were trying to turn it into a Christian song. And they were saying, basically, I don't have anxiety because I have Jesus, whatever. I'm like,
oh, I think I've seen that part.
I'm like, okay, but that seems like a blurred line to me.
Right. Yeah. It's an uncomfortable thing.
Right. I'm like,
well, when people, did the parody songs of, I like big books and I cannot lie down with the Bible, which, I've referred to a number of times. Okay.
That's almost cringy.
But yeah, because of the fact that it is building on a thing.
Right.
Or even like how many of the, whether it's your TikToks or whatever else that use, with the gangster glasses and stuff, and they play the little intro from the next episode, and gets in your head.
Yeah, you were talking about that last week.
And because last week I was trying to remember what song that was, so I looked it up and I'm like, because I knew it was Snoop.
Don't go down a Snoop Dogg black hole.
Well, it really is that.
Because like when they did the Super Bowl a couple of years ago, I'm like, yeah, I love this. I'm like, this is horrible.
Right. So I'm looking up next episode. So I'm looking at the lyrics. I'm like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
No, it's not like I didn't know that Snoop Dogg had some pretty vile stuff, but that's all it is. It's just vile stuff. And that's not even as bad as a lot of stuff today. I'm watching you may know what I'm talking about. I'm really over the whole body deodorant commercials on television. It's crass and the product is the product, but I'm like, really? Anyway, there are just things that we don't have to talk about the way we talk about them or demonstrate the way we demonstrate them. And so they used a song, which I couldn't believe was from 2002 from a rapper named Kia, who nobody probably even remembers from back in the day. And it's a female empowerment song, but it is explicitly, horrifically pornographic. And here they're using it in a commercial.
What song is it?
I don't even want to refer to it actually. Okay. But they're using it in commercial, in a mainstream thing, and using the chorus line from the from the song, and I'm just astonished constantly. And it takes a lot to shock me at this point, but I am regularly just kind of shaking my head at how much we take really, really profoundly, explicitly anti-God, anti-moral messages and mainstream them.
But that's the thing. It often gets sneaked in there,
right,
to the point where we become kind of numb to it, or maybe we don't recognize it right away. We just think it's normal, and I
we
think
joke about it, like you were saying, it's kind of cringy with the song.
And but the fact that it can be very subtle,
and I've been guilty of it myself.
Right?
It gets into your normal way of thinking
because it sneaks in very subtly.
Yeah.
And
I think music in particular has a way of
for sure. That, so. And I think, kind of what we were talking about on Sunday and what we're going to get into here is it's important to hate sin.
Yeah.
But that's
hard to do.
That's not always easy to do when you're literally surrounded by it 24/7 and it's kind of sneaking into your psyche. Or, I could be walking down the street and have the lyrics to a Snoop Dogg song in my head, and I'm not thinking
and
that.
You may, because we talked about it.
Right. And I'm not thinking, oh, this is sinful, because it's just in there.
Right.
But so I think keep your.
So you actually think through the lyrics.
Right. And then you're like, oh my goodness. So I think the big thing here is, how do we keep our radar on?
Right.
24 hours a day.
I have to commend you on your outstanding segue here. And at the same time, this in all of our normal inane banter at the beginning, this actually
made a little bit of sense.
This was pretty directly tied to what we're talking about from Jump Street. So another 90s reference, but the
peak Johnny Depp.
We used to watch that pretty faithfully. Shelley and I did. One of our regular staple shows. That and Quantum Leap was another big one.
I've never seen Quantum Leap.
Oh, it's good. Anyway, yeah, I'm very dated. I'm sure everything is, but
the remake they did of 21 Jump Street in the early 2000s was horrible.
I didn't watch it, but wasn't Channing Tatum in it?
Yeah, what's his face?
I like Channing Tatum, but I find that I can't watch most of his movies.
He literally plays the same character in every movie. Literally.
Well,
he's a one-trick pony.
He's a stripper and everything, or?
Yes, pretty much.
What was the canine movie he did with the dog? Was it just called Dog? I think it was called Dog, where he's a cop or a recovering veteran or something, and has a canine dog that. Canine dog, K9 dog.
The only one I've seen where he's a veteran was Dear John.
I heard of that, but I never saw it.
Nicholas Sparks.
Yeah.
So somebody dies.
So somebody dies. It's just normal. So anyhow, as we were talking about the actual concept, our core reality, again, for last week, this week, and next week, is that to love God wholeheartedly, we must hate sin wholeheartedly. And like you said, that's hard to do in a world where we normalize it all the time. And sometimes
it's don't even realize it.
Right. Yeah. We're so, it's like a fish not realizing it's wet.
Right.
Where it's just so normal that you don't, until the light comes into the darkness, you don't realize how dark it's gotten.
Mm-hmm.
And it is funny, like in the evening, if you're driving or whatever, as at dusk, and it's light and you're out in it, you don't notice how dark it's gotten until you get out of that for a minute, or you turn away from that, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, it's really dark.
Right.
all I did was open the door, put my shoes inside, and I come out. How did it get so dark? Well, it's been dark, but that gradual, that slow fade, we haven't noticed so much. And so as we've been working through this idea of devoted to the Lord for destruction, this kind of a topical sermon, which became a mini series within our Wholehearted series, that we have really had to kind of wrestle with. How do we square the circle when we look at our loving God who hates sin, and we see his wrath in the Old Testament, and we've heard so much in our world about God is love, God is love, God is love, and his mercy and his mercy and his mercy, and all these different things that portray God as kind and benevolent. And it's not that any of that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
It's that we have a multifaceted God, an infinite God, and we kind of wimp him down here. We want to kind of dilute God down to a single character, right? So all we see is the one attribute of God in his kindness. Well, the reason that God's kindness draws us to repentance is the realization that he has no reason to offer us kindness. Mercy is only mercy if it is in contrast with wrath, right? Otherwise, it's not really mercy. It's just niceness to go along. So then we kind of create this image of God as the doddering, kind-hearted, maybe a slightly senile grandfather who just likes to give us candy and everything's happy and, spoils us rotten. And we wouldn't say that about God, generally speaking, but that tends to be how we end up looking at him. God wants me to be happy. God would never say no. God would never judge me for this thing that I consider my nature. It's who I am. It's how God made me. And so then we end up blaming God for our sinfulness. But, the Bible has 66 books. 39 of them are the Old Testament. And so in a general sense, I will say the God of grace is throughout and the God of wrath is throughout. But generally speaking, if we're talking about the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, that's, you're talking about more than 2/3 of the book, right? Most of the Bible is about God's anger against sin, fallen humanity failing to live up to God's standard. Israel, God's chosen covenant people, failing to live up to God's standard, continually sinning and turning their back on God. And yet he's faithful to them. And yet throughout all of that, he pours out his wrath, his anger. He judges the nations. He judges his enemies. He judges his children. He puts these blessings and cursings side by side in the law, so that we see that. And that's a major theme of what we see in Deuteronomy, Leviticus as well. But I think it really is brought out heavily at the end of Exodus into Leviticus. And then when we get to Numbers, we see it play out. God has said, do this and live, do this and die. If you follow me, then you'll be my people. I'll be your God. If you reject me, well, then you're going to end up, dealing with the same stuff that all these surrounding nations do. In Numbers, we see that actually happen with the first generation. And so they all die in the wilderness. And now we get to this place in Deuteronomy where the second generation is coming and ostensibly, hopefully, learning the lessons from the first. And the book of Joshua would indicate that they do, because they walk with God. Joshua leads them in God's ways, and they have victory upon victory. So here in Deuteronomy, they're about to enter, and they have kind of this pre-conquest conquest as they're defeating the Amorites under the kings Sihon and Og, who are two different kingdoms within the nation. And as they do this, it almost feels like a throwaway in this retelling that Moses gives, but we can't get past it. Mm-hmm. God doesn't intend us to get past it, and he'll command it later in chapter 7. But we have this little thing that, we wiped them out. We left no survivors. We killed them all, men, women, and children. No survivors. And it's like, wow, what do we do with that? So we looked last time at really the holiness of God and the idea that God is, he is more holy than we tend to think about. And specifically, we said God's holiness is more glorious than we understand. And so the focus, this was John Calvin's primary focus as he was looking at Scripture and all of the things that whether you love him or hate him, all the things that Calvin built out or thought through in his Institutes of the Christian Religion or any number of different things that he did. we're all through the lens of God's glory is bigger than everything else. God is glorious. God is holy. He is thrice holy. That his holiness is manifest in his glory. He is just overwhelmingly God, right? And other and different, and nothing matters outside of God's glory, and everything else hinges on that. Well, then if we recognize that because God is holy and he's glorious in his holiness, and is more than what we generally comprehend. We think of God as out there somewhere, and then we see all of the things around us as real. And God is maybe something we add on to our lives, and maybe he's a religious concept and all that. And the scriptures are saying, no, God is the reality within which everything else resides. So not the pantheism where God is in this microphone and all that kind of stuff, but God is separate, he's other, he's outside of his creation, and yet everything exists by his will and within his as derivative of his character and a reflection of his glory. And we exist to love him wholeheartedly. We exist to be a reflection of his glory. Therefore, sin, which is the opposite of this, it's the opposite of all that God loves, it's the opposite of his character. It creates this separation between us and God. And because God is holy and we are made to be holy, he requires a holy people. And if we're going to be his, the only way we can be his is to be holy as he is holy. That's the crux of what he tells Israel. It's what we need to see as the church. We see Israel fail at it. So the call now in Deuteronomy is live for me wholeheartedly, set your everything apart to me. And so you'll be this reflection. The problem is that anything that falls short of that standard, anything that's not holy, God must, because holiness requires this, justice requires this, must destroy. So it's sin is contrary, it's opposite, it's rebellion, even when it's more covert than overt. It's all the antithesis of God. It's the antithesis of God's perfection. It's the antithesis of what God created us for. And so the depravity of sin is far worse than we realize. And we, in our efforts at times in evangelical world to try to make people understand that sin is bad, right? We've actually done the opposite.
Right.
So we say that, all sin is the same. All sin is sin. No sin is worse than another. And that's not actually true as we look at the scripture. And I think it's pretty simple for us to recognize stealing a piece of bubble gum is bad. Right? Murdering a baby is worse, right? It'd be pretty hard not to say that. And we can see that not only from a human perspective, but in the scripture, there are sins that carry smaller penalties and sins that carry greater penalties. But what we need to see is not that all sin is the same, clearly not. Lusting after a woman is a bad thing, that commit adultery in your heart. Actually committing that adultery is another level. Right. So there's a difference there. But at its root, in that relationship between us and God, sin, it's not that all sin is the same, it's that all sin is sin. There are no small sins. So we've tended to bring big sins down to make them equal to what we might call peccadillos, a word that I'm having fun saying lately. It's just fun to say peccadillo. Anyway.
It makes me want salsa.
There you go. Sorry. I can see that.
Like pico de gallo.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Or pickles. Or
pickle lemonade.
We kind of flatten out sin. But what we need to do is elevate our idea of sin so that there are in our minds, we see sin the way God sees sin. Because the truth of it is the depravity, the depth, the corruption of sin, of any small drop of sin, if you will, destroys everything.
Right.
Now, can there be more? Yes. Can we stack sins? Yes. We invent new ways to sin, but it's worse than we realize because all sin is a rejection of our purpose and a rebellion against God. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's that big headline sin or if it's the pride inside that we don't realize. It exalts itself above the knowledge of God. It puts my understanding ahead of trusting God. So now it's not so much a matter of God is glorious and I obey him because he is glorious and holy. It's if I think so, or I'll obey God to a certain extent, or, yeah, I know that particular song is pretty immoral, but
it's so catchy.
It's so catchy.
Right.
It's no big deal, or, I can watch this program that is, everybody's sleeping with everybody else and it's celebrating sinful things. And well, it won't affect me, right. I know better. So it's pretty entertaining and that's like real life. So we might as well watch it.
And also those things tend to snowball.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Like you use the illustration often of baby dragons, but these things get bigger. And if you think one small thing is okay, then again, you're moving the line.
Yeah.
I'm moving the line because I certainly do those things. And then at the end of the day, when you're laying in bed and you're thinking, oh no, what am I? And then you spiral into this anxiety thing because it's like, that passage that you use often where it's like, I'm ruined. What am I doing? I'm horrible.
Right.
And, but then you start over the next day and these little things chip away at you again and again. So it's just, I think, a matter of constantly being vigilant about these things.
Yeah. And learning to see them through God's eyes. Again, we have this tendency to look at sin according to humanistic categories. So how does this affect people? So we think of victimless crimes. It's a sin that doesn't really hurt anybody. So it's no big deal, but it is an attack, an affront, a treason against God. Right. And when we begin to see things that way, that the tiniest sin, eating a fruit in the garden, that is what set off all these things.
Wild.
As far as separating us from God, the worst serial killer could not be more separated from God than the one who ate the fruit in the garden. Right. Now, is there a greater level of punishment? Yes, there's death and then there's death, right? And so there's, we see that type of delineation throughout the Old Testament and the prophets. We see it in the book of Revelation that there will be a judgment according to deeds. So there will be, if you think of Milton or Dante's Inferno or whatever, which are not necessarily biblical, they're fictionalization. They're thinking through it in a poetic way, particularly Dante. But the picture of these, like Dante's concentric circles of hell, where it narrows down into the intensity of this, I think that's the picture we should be seeing from whether Dante is capturing it accurately and literally is less the point than the fact that it's all sin. Right. It's all separation from God. It's all death, eternal condemnation. But there are also levels along with that. Not necessarily the purpose of our study today, but it is worth recognizing that however we spin it, all sin is a rejection of our purpose. All sin is a rebellion against God. And therefore, there is a path, a price to pay. And so we'll look this coming week at God's wrath against that sin. So we talked some about it because God is perfection, because of his glorious holiness and the depravity of sin. God's wrath against sin is necessary. It's inevitable, and we have to come to terms with that, so that when God is having Israel wipe out these people completely, that's what we all deserve. Israel deserved that too. It's only God's mercy that isn't the lot of everyone. Noah's flood wiped out everyone, men, women, and children. No survivors, no mercy. And yet God, in mercy, saved 8 people through that flood. In the same way, we will see that as God pours out his wrath, and we read from Romans chapter 1, which I strongly recommend. We don't, for the sake of time, we can't read that now, but I strongly recommend to folks to read that on their own, verses 18 to the end, to see this picture of God's wrath being poured out. And hopefully it'll help you see this is not a picture of, well, this sin is worse than that sin or anything else. This is God's wrath. He's giving us over to our sinful desires. He's giving us over to those things that we desire ahead of him. And there is a natural penalty in them. Sin is its own punishment, in addition to the fact that there is eternal condemnation separate from him.
Okay, we're a little bit over today, so we will stop there. But thank you guys for listening. And yeah, feel free to catch us on Sunday mornings. We live stream on Facebook and YouTube, or you can catch up on the podcast whenever you have the time and want to listen to this current series that we're in. And we've been pretty consistent with Thursdays lately too. So
I don't even know what to say about that.
We'll probably miss next Thursday.
Seems inevitable now that we said
Thank you guys for listening, and we will catch you later.
Ciao.
Goodbye, YouTube.
Adios, YouTube. Have a pickle.